Okay. So of you who are on here, would you like me to share the source sheet on screen, or do you have that available in front of you? Again, feel free to just post in the chat or something about what you would prefer. Okay, fine. I will do a share screen. I mean, you'll get a share screen with my notes as well. Okay, so let's get started. So with Rosh Hashanah a little more than a week away, I wanted, as per the title of the shiur, to explore why we blow the 100 blasts that we do blow on Rosh Hashanah. Now, there's precious little in the Torah which is explicit about how much shofar we should blow. And we'll see as we go through, there's an interesting layering. If we have a Torah requirement, then there's a rabbinic add-on, and then there's a custom which comes on top of that as well. So I wanted to go through and just explore how we get from, as I've said in the title, the Torah says it's a Yom Teruah, it's a day of blowing shofar, how we get from that to the practice that we have today. So the first indication of the structure of the shofar blast that we do is found in the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah in source number 1. Seder Tekias, the order of the blowing of shofar on Rosh Hashanah, is shalosh, means we have 3 sets. Now here Rashi says, what are the 3 sets? We have one on Malchias, one on Zichronos, one on Shofaros, which, as we are familiar with, these are the 3 blessings that we say in the Musaf Amida on Rosh Hashanah: kingship, remembrance, and the Shofaros. So Rashi is already indicating to us here that the initial requirement is not quite how we're familiar with it. The Mishnah is talking about blowing shofar in the order of the Amida, and as we know, that's not exactly when we start. But the basic and primary requirement is we blow the shofar 3 times on the 3 different brachas in the Musaf Amida. 3 times shall shalosh shalosh, and each time we blow 3 blasts, as Rashi explains, a tekiah and a teruah and a tekiah for each of these 3 brachas. So the Mishnah is telling us we blow 3 triplets of notes, and those triplets are associated with the 3 blessings in the Musaf Amida. And the question is, where exactly does this come from? So the Gemara analyzes and tells us exactly where this whole setup came from. And so it starts in the Psukim, the Pasuk in relation to Rosh Hashanah, in source number 2, it says, on the first day of the 7th month, Yom Teruah yiyeh lachem, it'll be a day of Teruah. Now we're actually going to have to clarify what exactly does it mean, a day of Teruah. We'll see it's not actually clear, and there's a whole discussion of what exactly the Pasuk means when it says Teruah. But the Pasuk in relation to Rosh Hashanah just tells us that it's a day of Teruah. And then we'll see the Gemara is going to work out how exactly this should be done, largely based on another Pasuk which we have in relation to the Yovel year. So on the Yom Kippur in the Yovel year, there was a requirement to blow the shofar, and that was what signaled various aspects of the Yovel year coming in, such as servants going free and land going back to its original. Originally, the Eretz Yisrael was split up, and the land was given to different families. And in the Yovel year, all the land was reset and went back to its original family, and that was signaled by the blowing of the shofar blast. Sorry, 1 second. Apparently, someone is trying to join. Okay, no, I think we're good. So the Gemara then explains to us how we use the second pasuk to build out the mitzvah of shofar. This is in source number 3. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, Tanu Rabbanan. So the rabbis taught minayin sheba shofar. So how do we know using a shofar? Because actually the pasuk just told us it's a day of teruah. But we see in the Torah, in other places, that the teruah can also be done with trumpets, with chatzot. So how do we actually know that in this context we're talking about a shofar blast, which is a very fundamental question, and that's the first stage in our analysis. So how do we know it's with a shofar? Talmud lema v'havarta shofar teruah. So in the second pasuk that we had in relation to Yovel, it said that you will use the shofar teruah. It's a teruah done with a shofar. Okay, step one, we now know we're using a shofar. So how do we know that you then have a straight blast before it? So the Torah told us this day of Teruah, and the Mishnah said we have a tekiah before and after. So where does that come from? Talmud Loma v'havarta shofar Teruah. So if we look at that posuk by the Yovel, it says, and you shall cause to pass a shofar blast. And Rashi says, v'ha'avarta, this language of causing to pass, pashuta mashma. This word suggests you've got a straight and somewhat long sound. Havaras kol echad, so you have one long sound that you cause to pass, and the posuk had that before teruah. So we have a tekiah before the teruah. And how do we then know that there's a tekiah, a straight sound that comes afterwards? Because towards the end of the posuk, it then says, then you shall cause a shofar blast to pass. And says Rashi points out, the language of causing to pass is there at the beginning and at the end of the pasuk, and with a teruah ksiva ben time, with a teruah in the middle. And so we learn from here the triplet setup that we have with a tekiah followed by a teruah followed by a tekiah. So we've established the nature of a triplet, but so how do we get to the three sets of triplets that the Mishnah described? And you shall cause the shofar blast to pass. That's one posuk we had by the Yovel. There's another posuk which says Shabbosim Zichron Teruah. There's a rest day of a remembrance of shofar blast, and there's another posuk which says Yom Teruah Yelochem. It'll be a day of Teruah. And Rashi explains Teruah Tlos Zimni. We've now found three different psukim which talk about having a teruah. And then, as we've learned out from the Yovel, each one has a note before and a note after. So based on the word teruah appearing three times in the Torah, we then learn out you have three teruahs, and each teruah is accompanied by a tekiah before and after, giving us three triplets. But then, okay, the Torah says it three times, the word teruah, but it doesn't say them in the same context. That two of these psukim are talking about Rosh Hashanah, which is Yom Teruah and Zichron Teruah, and one of them is talking about the Yom Kippur of Yovel. So how do you know to put all of these three together to actually say we have three triplets? How do we know to put them all together? Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, Shavi, Shavi, Ligazera Shava. In all of these contexts, we do have the word Shavi, saying it's in the seventh month, and this is a Gezerah Shava. So Chazal had a tradition of certain key words when used in different places in the Torah to link the different areas together. And one of these is our context over here by shofar. So because it says the word Shavi relating to the month of Tishri, in the context of this Rosh Hashanah and the Yom Kippur of Yovel, Chazal had the tradition to link them all together. And then so what happens is you end up with Shalosh Shehin Tesha. You end up with three sets, which give you 9 blasts in total. So we've now established that we have three triplets, each of which has a tekiah before and a tekiah and after and a teruah in the middle, giving us 9 notes altogether. We've now established the Torah requirement, and we won't read it inside, but that's codified in the Shulchan Aruch in source number 4. This is the origin of our Torah requirement, which is, as he just starts off to say, how many kama tekiyas chayvot on Nishma Rosh Hashanah Teisha. The Torah requirement on Rosh Hashanah is to hear 9 shofar blasts. So that's still a very, very long way from what we do. By the way, if people have questions or whatever and they want to chime in at any point, feel free to come off mute and ask if there's anything you want to ask or anything you want to clarify. Okay, so we've established that there are 9 notes which you have to do, but there's a basic question, which is we've said that the middle blast is called a teruah, which is what the Torah focuses on. It says it's a day of teruah. But the question is, what exactly is a teruah? Now, we colloquially know the teruah as the blast of 9, these the staccato 9 short notes. That's what we call a teruah. But it's not obvious when you read the Chumash. That's actually what's intended by a teruah, and we'll see. This actually was a subject of discussion and potentially debate in the Gemara, which is how we then expand out what the Torah requirement of shofar is. And so it expands out as follows. The Mishnah said in source number 5 that a shiur teruah. So what is the teruah that we have? It's kasholish yabavos. It's like 3 yabavos, which is a phrase we'll go on to analyze in a minute. But the way at least some of the Rishonim understand the Mishnah, and this is the way that's consistent with what we do, is it's 3 yabavos, where 1 yabava is 3 short blasts. So a teruah being 3 yabavos, that makes a teruah 9 individual short blasts. That's what the Mishnah says. And then the Gemara asks, Tanya, but don't we have another source, which is a brisa, which tells us that shiur teruah kashlosha shavarim, that actually the teruah is 3 shavarim, 3 broken blasts, which are the blasts, which, as we know, they're 3 longer sounds rather than 9 very short sounds in a teruah. There are 3 longer sounds in what we call a shavarim. So this brisa is saying actually a teruah is not the 9 short blasts, rather it is these 3 longer blasts that we call shavarim. So we seem to have a dispute over here. So Amar Abai Pliki, Abai says, yeah, indeed there's a dispute over here. Yom Teruah. The Torah says it should be a day of Teruah. But again, what is a Teruah? So Yom Yibava. So if we look at Onkelos, the Aramaic translation of the Torah, Onkelos says it should be a day of Yibava. So what exactly is a Yibava? So the Gemara continues, a Chasiv B'imei de Sisra. And it's said by the mother of Sisra. Now, Sisra was the Canaanite general who fought against the Jewish people in the time of Devorah the judge. And when Devorah is singing her famous song after the Jews win the battle, she describes Sisra's mother anticipating, waiting for him to come home, and ultimately her upset on discovering that he's not going to. And it says, she looked out of the window, Sisra, and the mother of Sisra wailed. So we have, based on Onkelos's translation of the pasuk of the word teruah, and then comparing it to the pasuk in Shoftim, we learned this word yabava is a wail or a cry. Okay, but then there are different types of crying. So that's what's happening in Marasava. The view which said that the teruah is like 3 shavarim, these 3 longer sounds, he understood that the crying was a ginuche gonach. And the English word's a little bit difficult to choose the right one, but it's some sort of moan or some sort of groan. Rashi explains, it's like someone who is groaning or moaning from their heart when they're ill, and they give these somewhat long sounds. And so probably the best English translation is like a moan or a groan of some description. So that's this opinion understood that the yabava is a longer groaning sound, and the opinion which said it was a teruah, these 9 short blasts, understood that it meant a yulil, which is perhaps best translated as a wailing sound. Like a person who is wailing, and they make shorter sounds. So it's more of a sobbing, where a person is broken down and having much shorter individual sounds in their cry. That was the understanding of the view, which says that a teruah is what we have as the 9 short blasts. So based on this analysis here in the Gemara, we have 2 different options for what a teruah is. One option is that it's a longer moaning or groaning sound, which is what we call a shavarim, and the other opinion is these much shorter sounds, which correspond to the 9 staccato blasts that we call a teruah. So we've got 2 possible options here so far. And there seems to be a dispute, and perhaps different rabbis would have ruled different ways for their community. But then the Gemara goes on and gives us, first of all, a 3rd addition as to what the teruah might be, and then some kind of unification of the practice so that we do all 3. This is the Gemara in source number 6, there in the Daf Lamed Daled in Rosh Hashanah. So asking Rabbi Abai the Kisyu, Rabbi Abai in Caesarea instituted the following: that you should do the following group of blasts. You should do a tekiah. Shlosha Shavarim, followed by 3 Shavarim. Teruah, this is then followed by a Teruah, and then a Tekiah at the end. So far, this is nothing like the two, was different to the two you've had before, which was either a Tekiah and a Shavarim and a Tekiah, or a Tekiah and a Teruah and a Tekiah. Here, Rabbi Abai was saying you introduce a group of notes which contains both of them. It has a Tekiah followed by 3 Shavarim, followed by a Teruah, followed by a Tekiah. And the Gemara asks, what's your logic? If, as we said before, the cry that is being referenced here is these shorter wailing sounds, tekiah, teruah, tekiah, then you should be doing just a tekiah, then a teruah, and a tekiah. And if it's a groaning sound, tekiah, shlosha, shavarim, tekiah, you should then be doing just a set, which is a tekiah and a shavarim and a tekiah. Why is Rabbi Abaye doing both of them together? So he says, so the question was whether he was he was doubtful as to which of the two versions that we had are correct. So the two sources we had before were a Mishnah and a Brisa, which were Tanaitic in origin. And so there we had two different opinions. And then Rabbi Abahu, who is an Amora in the period of time of the Gemara, he was doubtful as to which of these to do. So he says you should do both. You should do a Shavarim as a groan, and you should do a Yulil as a wail. So you should be doing both of them. Fine. But Masif Rav Avira then raises the following question. Well, if it's a whale, then when Rabbi Abaye instituted this grouping with a tekiah, then a shavarim, and a teruah, and a tekiah, if the teruah was the right note, then you've got a shavarim interrupting in the middle of the triplet. We've established before that these shofar blasts need to be done in triplets. So if you're interposing with a note which is out of place, it's a hefsek, and that will then invalidate the grouping. So why is it that Rabbi Abaye has a shavarim interrupting if he really held that if he wants to act as if maybe the teruah is the right note? So the Gemara says, you're right, to hold the other tekiah, teruah, tekiah. It must be that he then, separately to the grouping he described, he also did a tekiah, a teruah, and a tekiah. And then Rabina has the same question. Well, maybe the correct blast was the shavarim, and therefore you're going to have the komasika teruah ben shavarim the tekiah. You've again, instead of having a tekiah shavarim tekiah, you've got a teruah thrown in there, and that's interrupting the triplet that should involve a shavarim. So again, why is he doing this grouping of 4? Answer is to have it tekiah shavarim tekiah. Okay, so the Gemara says you're right. He must have also done a separate set, just of a tekiah and a shavarim and a tekiah. So he said Rabbi Abaye, because he had doubt about what the shofar blast would be, he would have to do a tekiah and a teruah and a tekiah, and he'd have to do a tekiah and a shavarim and a tekiah, so you didn't have a wrong note interrupting. So then the question is, Ela Rabbi Abaye my iskin. Well, then what exactly did he institute in the first place when he gave us this grouping of a tekiah, shavarim, teruah, tekiah? We've just said he does triplets, one with a teruah and one with a shavarim. So why is he doing this grouping of 4 notes? Says the Gemara, no, because actually Rabbi Abaye has an extra doubt over him. Dilma ganach v'yalel. So we had before 2 doubts. Maybe the Torah is talking about a groan, or maybe it's talking about a wail. Rabbi Abaye says there's a third type it could be, which is a groan or followed by a wailing sound. Ihachi, and the Gemara says, if you're saying well, the cry in the Torah could involve both sounds, then you should do it the other way around as well. Rabbi Abaye said, tekiah, shavarim, teruah, tekiah. Well, maybe you should also do tekiah, teruah, shavarim, tekiah. Who said that the moaning sound came first and the wailing sound came second? Maybe it should be the other way around. So we said, stama de milsa, ki misra be'enish milsa, bereisha ganach v'hadayala. So the Gemara says, ordinarily, when something bad happens to someone and they start expressing their upset, the natural way of crying is this: a person starts off with these longer moaning and groaning, and then they break down into these shorter sounds, which we're calling wailing. So Rabbi Abaye has given us a third option for what the Torah might mean when it says a teruah. It could be this groan followed by a wail. So we've had 3 different possible options as to what the Torah means when it says it's a day of teruah, a day of crying. And the Gemara here has established that we're then that Rabbi Abahu would blow individually, one type for a teruah, one type for a shivarim, and one type for a shivarim and a teruah together. Now, as we've said, that you have to do a triplet, you have to do 9 notes with 6 tekias and 3 teruahs in the middle. So you've got 9, but now you've got 3 different types of teruahs over here. Then in total, you're going to do 27 notes. But because Rabbi Abahu, in this new doubt that he added, we have a shvarim and a teruah, we actually count each of those as a group of 4, not a group of 3. So you end up with 9 notes based around a shvarim, 9 notes based around a teruah, and 12 notes based around a shvarim and teruah. And so we end up with the 30 blasts that we are familiar with, and this is how we start off our shofar blowing as we are familiar with. And this is again codified in Shulchan Aruch, don't need to go through that. But we've got to the point now where we learned out the Torah requirement is to do these 9 basic blasts of 6 tekias and 3 teruahs, because there are 3 different possible types of teruahs. Then we end up with 30 notes. Now, there's a very interesting question over here, which is the Gemara, and it sounded, if we read it on the superficial level, or if we read it at face value as we have, then it sounds like it really was a doubt as to what the 3 different blasts, what the teruah was. There were 3 different permutations, and so we do all 3. Now, I'm not going to read it inside, but the Beis Yosef here quotes the Rishonim, the Rosh and the Ran, who quote Rav Haigon, who was the last of the Gaonic periods, I guess, right towards the end of the first millennia or the beginning of the second. I'm not entirely sure the exact century, but right at the end of the Gaonic period, before the period that we have called the Rishonim. And Rabbi Abai was asked about this, and he said, and the question was as follows. We've said that there are 3 different things that the Torah might mean when it says a teruah. And before Rabbi Abahu, it sounds like we had the Mishnah said one way and a Brisa said another way. So was it the case that according to one set of opinions, actually, according to one school of thought that did the Shavarim, was it those who did the Teruah didn't fulfill the mitzvah of Shofar? And those who believed that the Torah meant the Teruah, the short blast, did they believe that the people who are doing the Shavarim blasts were not fulfilling the mitzvah? So was it really the case that people were not definitively fulfilling the mitzvah of Shofar until Rabbi Abahu came to institute that we blow to cover all these bases? And so Rav Haigon says, actually, no, that's not the case at all. What really was there were actually 3 different practices about how to define a wail or a cry that the Torah says. But all of these were valid practices. These are all valid types of cry. And therefore, each community did either as a wail or as a moan, a shavarim or teruah, and all of these were absolutely acceptable. And so when Rabbi Abahu comes along and institutes to do all 3 types, this was not, as we had assumed, and how we read the Gemara at face value, that this was because there were 3 different possibilities, and out of doubt we do all 3. Rather, it was just a unification of the practice. So in order that we didn't have different communities doing different things, and it looked like people were arguing, even though really everyone agreed that all of these 3 options are valid, Rabbi Abahu came and instituted a unified practice of doing all these 3 types so that we didn't have these great divides in the Jewish people on Rosh Hashanah, with people doing different things, and people who are uneducated thinking that, oh, maybe the people who do it in their community different to ours are doing it wrong, etc. So he instituted a unifying practice just to bring unity across the practices across different communities. So that was how Rav Haigon explains what's going on over here. That really there wasn't really any doubt at all. It was just a unification of practices. But the Beis Yosef quotes the Rambam. And the Rambam, and the way he words it, is quite clear that these were actually doubts that developed over time. And just one phrase to point out is he said, according to the Orech Hashonim, the passage of time, the Rof HaGolos, and the extent of the exiles, it came up over time that there started to become a doubt as to how the shofar should be blown. Because really the question is, why would you have a dispute? Just ask what did they do last year and what did they do the year before? What did they do the year before? How do you end up with 3 possibilities? And the Rambam's explaining, because of the exile and the passage of time and communities being spread and dislocated around the world, these different possibilities of what the shofar blast should be came up, and it was doubtful, and therefore Rabbi Abai had to institute a unifying practice to indeed cover off all our possibilities. As we know, when we have a doubt about a Torah requirement, we're strict about it, and we make sure to cover off all the different options. So according to the Rambam, it was actually a doubt, and Rabbi Abai was instituting to do 30 blasts in order to cover off all our options to make sure we definitely fulfill the Torah requirement. Now, this dispute between the Rambam and Rav Hai Gaon is actually very, very significant, or it can have one very significant practical implication, which is there's a dispute I saw, and I don't remember who held which way, but there's an interesting question. People who can't get to shiur on Rosh Hashanah, we have kind people who go around and blow shofar for those who are unable to make it to shiur. So what happens, for example, if you've got a hospital with a number of Jewish patients on different wards, and you've only got one person who's available to come to the hospital, and they're sure they won't have the stamina to do 30 blasts for every individual across all the different wards that they go to. So the question is, what should they do? Should they just go until they run out of stamina? Should they do 30 blasts for each patient, and when they get to the end, they give up? Or should they actually blow just 10 blasts for each patient? Should they do a tekiah, a shavarim teruah, a tekiah, a shavarim, and a tekiah, and a tekiah, and a teruah, and a tekiah? Should they just do these 10 blasts? Now, if you go with the Rambam says, well, we have a doubt as to how to define a teruah in the Torah. It's a doubt about a Torah requirement, and therefore you would have to do 30 blasts for every person who runs out of stamina. Okay, then you couldn't get around to the rest of them. But if you take the approach of Rav Hai Gaon, really you can get away with doing 9 notes. You can even just do a tekiah teruah, tekiah 3 times, or tekiah shavarim teruah 3 times, tekiah shavarim tekiah 3 times, or tekiah shavarim teruah tekiah 3 times. You would just need to do 9 or 10 blasts, and you would definitely have done the Torah requirement, because any of these different sounds are valid. And in such a situation where a person has got lots of people to get to and not enough stamina, then it would be better that he does 9 or 10 notes per person in order that he's able to get around to as many people as possible. So it does at least have an interesting theoretical ramification as to whether these 30 notes are instituted out of doubt or instituted just as a unification of practice while acknowledging that each one of them is valid. But anyway, up to this point, we have explored the 30 blasts, and we've explored how these are all done in order to meet our Torah requirement. And as we saw in Rashi in the Mishnah at the beginning, the Mishnah was talking about blowing the shofar during Musaf, and that seems to be very original practice when at least you were just blowing the Torah requirement. It was instituted that should be done in the Amida according to the three, to be done one at each of the 3 brachos of Malchus, Zichronis, and Shofars. That's how it was originally done. But then the Gemara adds an extra thing, which is how we're most familiar with, which is we start blowing the shofar before we get to Musaf. And this is in source number 9. Why is it our practice that we blow shofar first when we're sitting? And here, when you mean sitting, we're talking about the phase before we've started davening Musaf, because once we're doing the Amidah, we're all standing up. And it seems that once upon a time when we did the blast, which we do after Kriyas HaTorah on Rosh Hashanah, they would indeed be sitting down. We don't do that anymore, but they would be sitting. So why do we do blast when we're sitting down, and why do we do it when we're standing up? In order to confuse the Satan. Now, there are various different explanations here of what it exactly means to confuse the Satan. Just to give a couple of them, Rashi says that we don't want the Satan to be accusing. Now, if you look at the beginning of Eov, it talks about how on Rosh Hashanah, Hashem was convening the council for judgment, and this was when the Satan, and Hashem was talking about how great Eov was, and this is when the Satan, the accusing angel, came and started making claims that Eov was only doing well because he was wealthy and had a great family, etc. But we see from there in Eov that there is, in Shamayim on Rosh Hashanah, we have this dialogue going on between those who are talking in favor and those who are accusing. And this accusing is the Satan. And we blow the shofar in order to confuse the Sultan, says Rashi, so that he shouldn't then accuse. So when we see that the Jews love and treasure the mitzvahs, so the Torah requirement was to do 30 blasts, but we love mitzvahs and we want to do as much as we can, so we add on beyond just what the basic Torah requirement was. This shows that we value mitzvahs, and that is enough to stop the Sultan from making his accusations when it comes to the judgment being performed on Rosh Hashanah. And it's just kind of interesting. The Torah, as we said at the beginning, it just describes Rosh Hashanah as a Yom Teruah, a day of blowing. Now, and there could be an indication in there possibly that Netziv says this, that actually the Torah's left it open. We've worked out from Sukkim like a minimum, which is 30, but the Torah's leaving it open to say, actually, this is a day to blow shofar. And by blowing shofar more, we are showing that we are treasuring and valuing the mitzvah. And this is enough to, as Rashi says, to block the words of the accuser in the judgment that goes on Rosh Hashanah. There are various other explanations here that we don't have too much time for, but another explanation based on Yerushalmi is that we know that when Moshiach comes, there'll be Yitokah b'shofar gadol. There will be a great shofar blast, which is sounded, which will herald the coming of Moshiach. And when Moshiach comes, as we often say around funerals in a shiva home, Bila hamaves l'netzach, death will finally no longer be with us, and the Soton is linked to the Malach hamaves. The Soton is linked to the process of a person being taken out of this world and being given a judgment of death. So when Moshiach comes, death will no longer be here, therefore the Soton will be out of a job. And so when he hears the shofar being sounded more than just what he expected here on Rosh Hashanah, that then gives him an expectation that Moshiach is coming and that he's no longer going to be around anymore, and he gets afraid, and he's no longer able to focus on accusing people on Rosh Hashanah. And so that's why, again, the Sochim gets preoccupied in this, and it isn't able to accuse, to make our judgments harsher on Rosh Hashanah. There's another, there are more explanations here on the source sheet if people want. There's quite a few different explanations here. It's just interesting. The Beis Yosef quotes a Zohar, which is kind of an interesting explanation as well, which is that on Rosh Hashanah, there's an initial judgment, and various people will have been decreed to die. And then what's the purpose of confusing the Satan is the shofar is blown, and that, because of the mercy which gets triggered by the blowing of the shofar, those who are decreed to have died, who'd been, so to speak, given over to the Satan and he knew who he was dealing with, the mercy which is triggered by the shofar blast means that those people then get mixed up with everyone else again, and the Satan no longer knows who is being told is going to die this year. And then the Zohar explains it buys a person time. So it gives time, as we have in the Aseret Shiva, for the person to do Shiva. So the initial decree of death is put on hold. If the person does Shiva, great. Eventually, the instructions all get sorted out again, and those who are unable to improve do indeed keep their decree of death. But this shofar blowing buys a person time to do tshuva and change their judgment. So we've now had the Gemara telling us that we have this extra blowing which happens before the Amida, which is, we're familiar with the 30 blasts we blow beforehand. And then that's in addition to the blast which we have during the Amida. Now, you'd think that how would we have? We have 30 notes to start with. And again, this is on top of what we had in the Amida, which is, we've established previously, should be 30 notes. And that should have got us to a point of 60. However, the Rif, one of the early Rishonim on the Gemara, he codifies that actually once we started doing the 30 blasts before the Amida, the practice became to only do 10 notes in the Musaf Amida, which they would do by Malchus, they would do the set of 4 notes, the Tekias Shofar, Teruah, and Tekiah. By Zechonos, they would do a Tekias Shofar and Tekiah, and by Teruahs, they would do by Shofars, they would do Tekiah, Teruah, and Tekiah. So instead of doing the 30 notes to cover all the different bases, we're only doing 10. And this, the Rif says very interestingly, this was the practice of the Kol Olam. Everyone does this. Was uniform practice across the Jewish world of Ishtei yeshivas, and the 2 yeshivas. These were the yeshivas of Surah and Pumbedisa. These were yeshivas which existed in Bovel from the time of the Gemara going through into the period of the Gaonim, and therefore, because they were the primary schools of learning in the times of the Gemara, you probably think that their practices best reflected what they were doing in the times of the Gemara. So it would seem that rather than doing 30 before and 30 during the Amidah, they were only doing 10 during the Amidah. And this has everyone a little bit puzzled. Why exactly were they only doing 10? Time is getting on, so I'll just explain the different options outside. So the Rif talked about not wanting to cause tircha, not wanting to cause too much effort to the community. We've already had 30 blasts before the Amidah, which is fulfill the Torah obligation, and therefore they wanted to try and minimize the further number of shofar blasts that we do during the Amidah down to 10. But still, it begs the question, why exactly is it 10? Now, the Ramban in the Milchemes Hashem has an interesting explanation, and he says we have the idea of blowing shofar during the Amidah is not something that's unique to Rosh Hashanah. We have this, there were various public fast days which were instituted, for example, lack of rain, and various other calamities which occurred, which are discussed in the Mishnayos and Tanis. There were various, there were various times when they would have these extra fast days, and during the Amidah of those, they would blow the shofar. But in the sugyas and Tanis, all they would do is they would blow one shofar blast for each of the blessings. So they would actually, if I remember correctly, they would, even in those fast days when they had these public fasts, they would also say the brachas of Malchus and Zichronos, but not shofars in Amidah, but they would say Malchus and Zichronos. And each of those was accompanied with a shofar blast. And this really comes back to the significance of the shofar as it's described in the Pesukim in Bamidbar, as it said, on the days of in the days of Simcha, on the days of Chagim, and also in the context there, days of battle, in times when we need to daven and we need rachamim from Hashem, we need mercy from Hashem. The tefillahs were always accompanied with a shofar blast. For various hashkafic or philosophical reasons that we probably don't have time to discuss now, but the shofar representing the purest and the most basic of all human cries for help, I guess. And that pure and distilled cry for help, which is symbolized in the shofar blast, is something which we then, the Psukim have told us is important to do around the times of battle, also around the times of Chagim. And so we see by the Tanios on the fast days, they would institute the shofar blast during the Amidah to add this extra aspect of requesting mercy through the sound of the shofar. And so the Ramban says, just as we have that concept of the shofar being there to be an extra plea for mercy in the Amidah, that's what we're doing in Rosh Hashanah as well. Now that we've already fulfilled the Torah obligation beforehand, the purpose of blowing the shofar in the Amidah is as this extra cry for mercy, and then there's no specific structure it has to take. As we said by Tanis, it could even just be one blast. And maybe because we've said that there are 3 different types of teruah that could be meant in the Torah, then on the Amidah and Rosh Hashanah, we do one type for each of the brachos, one with a shavarim and a teruah, one with a shavarim and one with a teruah. But it's all part of our request for divine mercy. And once we fill the Torah obligation of the 30, we don't have to be worried about exactly how many we're doing during the Amidah. That's how the Ramban explains what their practice was to do only 10 blasts in relation to this. And then the Beis Yosef quotes a Ritva and says gives another explanation. Why are we only doing 10? It's in line with Rav Gon's opinion. Rav Gon's opinion was that any of the different ways of doing a teruah are valid, any of the different kind of cries are valid. So when we're doing these sets of Tekias Shofar, Teruah, Tekiah, then a Tekias Shofar, Tekiah, and a Tekiah, Teruah, Tekiah, we have done enough to fulfill what will be the Torah obligation. We've done 3 teruahs, and we've surrounded it by Tekiahs on either side. So we've done what the Torah obligation was. So once we've already instituted before davening to do this unification of Rabbi Abahu, to do 30, to give recognition to all the different types of communities, then during the Amidah, we don't need to repeat and do 3 sets of each one. We're now recognizing that each one of these triplets are valid, and therefore we do one for Malchus, one for Zichronos, one for Shofros, and we don't need to do 30, we just do 10, because as Rafai said, really each of these sets is valid, and so we've done on the Musaf Amida, we've done enough to fulfill what would have been the Torah requirement. So that's the second explanation. The third explanation is Tosfos, which we'll pass over for now, given time. So that was the practice. Seems to be really the most old and would seem the most authentic practice going, which was the practice that came from the time of the Amoraim through to the time of the Gaonim and the Rishonim, which was just to blow 10 blasts during Musaf. Now, Rabbeinu Tam, and because we have this question, well, why are you not doubling, or why are you not tripling things up out of all the doubts? Rabbeinu Tam came up with an interesting modification to this practice, which he said, instead of doing the Tashrat, the Shavarim and Teruah in the first bracha, and Shavarim on the second and Teruah on the third, he said we should do Tashrat, which is Tekias Shofar and Teruah Tekiah, for each of the three brachas. We're not doing 3 sets of that for each bracha, but we just do one set of Tekias Shofar and Teruah Tekiah for each of the three brachas. Now, what's the logic for that? So Rabbeinu Tam says, because then in each set we've done a Shavarim, we've done a Teruah, and we've done a Shavarim and a Teruah. So whichever way around, it's incorporated in our set. Now, the Gemara had challenged Rabbi Abahu that if you're doing that, then you're having interruptions within a set. If the Teruah was the right sound, what's the Shvarim doing in the set? And if the Shvarim is the right sound, what's the Teruah doing in the set? But Rabbeinu Tam says we're not overly concerned about having interruptions in our shofar blowing, because he quotes a Gemara which says that if a person heard the 9 Torah required blasts on Rosh Hashanah in 9 different hours in the day, they've still fulfilled their obligation. Seemingly, therefore, we're not too bothered, at least after the fact, about having interruptions between the different blasts. And therefore, he said, in order to not change this practice, which, as we said, is very authentic and comes from all the way back from the Gaonim and beyond, he didn't want to change that practice too much, but to recognize the fact that really the blast in the Amida, as we said, that was initially where they made sure to fulfill the Torah requirements, and that was the initial primary blowing of the shofar. You want to make sure, says Rabbeinu Tam, that at the very least, in some sort of level, you have covered all 3 options of the Teruah by each bracha of the Amida. And so he said, we'll just do a Tekiah, Shavarim, Teruah, and Tekiah by each one, and then we've given reference to a Shavarim and a Teruah and a Shavarim Teruah by each of the brachas, and that's enough to have fulfilled the Torah requirements if you are not too concerned about having one note interrupting a set if the other note is the one that's actually correct. So that's the practice of Rabbeinu Tam. And if you look in Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch, for quoting what Sephardi practice was, quotes the practice that was of the Rif, that they would just do the 10 blasts, the Tekias Shofar Teruah Tekiah on one set, Tekias Shofar Teruah on the second, and Tekiah Teruah Tekiah on the third. And the Ramah for Ashkenazi practice quotes Rabbeinu Tam, which is that we just do one set of Tekias Shofar Teruah Tekiah by each bracha. As we know, that's not actually what we do. We eventually do the approach which was quoted by Tosfos of the Aruch, and this is really the approach all the Rishonim said would have made the most sense. The primary blowing of the shofar used to be in the Amida. We've said you have to do 30 blasts to fulfill the Torah obligation, so you should be having 30 blasts in the Amida. And this is exactly what the Aruch says. Tosfos quotes the Aruch that he said that we would do shloshim ala seder, right at the end of it. Here we would do 30 blasts over the course of Musaf. How do you get to 30? The same way we got to 30 before the Amida. You're doing 3 sets of each possible option for a Teruah. So in order to cover all our bases on the Torah requirement, we said we do 30 notes. So the Aruch said you did 30 notes before the Amida, 30 notes during the repetition of the Amida, and now we have the blowing of the Amida has kept its primacy in as much as it's meeting all the possible permutations you need for the Torah requirement. And this is the view of the Aruch, and this is now the widespread practice, is that we blow 30 blasts during the Amida, during the repetition of the Amida on Musaf as well. Now there's an interesting nuance here, which given time I think we will miss over, but the Shulchan Aruch, the way we do it in the Musaf Amida is by each bracha we then do Tekias Shofar Teruah Tekiah, Tekias Shofar Tekiah, Tekiah Teruah Tekiah, because we're saying there are 3 possibilities for what a Teruah is, and we want to make sure we get at least one valid triplet by each bracha. So we do one of each possible permutation for each bracha so that we cover all our bases. Shulchan Aruch doesn't seem to say that, but I think just in the interest of time, we'll probably pass that over for now, but if anyone wants to look at it, it's there. And what we're left now with is we've had the Torah requirement of 30 blasts, we've had the rabbinic addition of doing another 30, so you have some before the Amidah, some during the Amidah. But as we know, we do 100 blasts, and the question is, where does that come from? And this is a very interesting source, and this is again this Tosfos that we quoted before, quoting the Aruch. And the Aruch says we do 100 as follows. So after Shloshim Keduyosim, we do 30 sitting before the Amidah. Shloshim Belachash. Now the Aruch says there's 30 blasts to happen in the silent Amidah. This is what we don't do this, and most communities don't. Some communities with a more Kabbalistic bent do actually do 30 blasts during the silent Amidah, but we don't do this. We don't do 30 in the silent Amidah, as the Aruch says, but there's 30 before, there's 30 ala Seder, 30 in the repetition. Then if you add in the 30, which the Aruch says you do in the silent Amidah, which we then add on at the end, after the Musaf repetition, we do another 30 notes. And then you add on another 10, because we actually do 40 notes at the end. You end up with 100 blasts, which are Keneged Me'or Pius to Pi Ime de Sisra. You end up with 100 blasts corresponding to the 100 wails of the mother of Sisra. Now, we were introduced to the mother of Sisra early on. She was very helpful to us in defining what was a teruah. The teruah, which Unclus says was a yubova, and we learned from the mother of Sisra that a yubova is a cry. So the mother of Sisra, for some very interesting reason, is very deeply entrenched into the blowing of shofar. And Chazal had a tradition that when she cried for her son Sisra when he didn't return from battle, she made 100 cries, and therefore the custom developed to add an extra 40 blasts at the end, aside from the 60 we've already established to meet the Torah and Rabbinic requirement. We add on another 40 out of custom to parallel the 100 wails of the mother of Sisra. And this is codified in the Shulchan Aruch. We won't see that there are 100 blasts. Shulchan Aruch just says you do a teruah gedola at the end after davening. It doesn't talk about doing an extra 30 or 40. But the Mishnah Berurah codifies from the Shla that we add on these extra 40 blasts at the end of davening to hit the 100. And the seeming reason is from the mother of Sisra's 100 cries. And the question is, what was the mother of Sisra got to do with anything in terms of why would we want to pattern the blowing of shofar after the cries of the mother of Sisra? And in honest truth, I haven't found an entirely fully convincing explanation in the searching that I've done. The most the reason that probably seems to be the reason for this is that the crying of the mother of Sisra was the crying demonstrating the mercy of the mother towards the child, even though her child Sisra was he was an army general and had lots of blood on his hands. Nonetheless, the crying of the mother demonstrates the mercy of the mother towards the son, whatever their actions were. And so on Rosh Hashanah, that's really what we're asking Hashem, to have mercy on us wherever we actually are and whatever negative decree might have been coming our way. We're using the shofar as a call to asking Hashem for mercy, and we're asking Hashem to have mercy on us, whether or not we're really worthy by the strict standard of judgment which Rosh Hashanah may have entailed. And the shofar is the mechanism by which we request this mercy from Hashem. And so the mercy of the mother towards the child that is demonstrated by the crying of Sisra's mother for her child is something which we invoke over here. That's probably that's at least one explanation of why the 100 cries of the mother of Sisra is so relevant to us and why that's something we try and copy. One further explanation, and this is Rabbi Roselaw, when he saw me advertising the shiur, he'd given the same shiur somewhere else yesterday and sent me his shul sheet, and he has a totally different explanation here, quoted in the Torah Shalema, which is a connection of Midrashim by Rav Nachum Kasha. And he quotes Midrashim, which talk, as we know, the Akedah, when Yitzchak was offered up and then not offered up on Rosh Hashanah, is a fundamental theme on Rosh Hashanah, and it shows demonstrates our full commitment to Hashem, and is something which then acts as a source of mercy for us in the judgment on Rosh Hashanah. And the Midrash tells us that at the beginning of Chayei Sora, Sora died because the Sultan had showed her an image of the Akedah, but it showed her in a way which showed Yitzchak dying. And Sora, then in great distress, cried significantly, and that was what led to her passing away. And the Midrashim then relate the crying of Sarah to the shofar. There's a medrash brings at the beginning that she did 3 cries, which is like the 3 teruahs, and then there's a further 6 kind of cries, which are the tekias as well. And then another medrash talks about the fact that she let out 90 wails. And so Rav Menachem Kasher suggests that actually the 90 wails of Sora is what we're trying to match over here. I have not fully understood then why we're doing 100, and seemingly we're rounding up this 90 to 100, and it's the 100. We're trying to blow 100 blasts to invoke the merit of Sora Imenu, and that's then gives us a reason which probably more naturally fits in the theme of the day, that we're trying to invoke merits and Rachmim and Shamayim. So that's why it would be based on Sarah, because that's a more natural fit, that we're invoking Rachamei Shamayim by trying to invoke Sarah's cries. Again, it's not entirely clear why we're doing 100 rather than 90, but there we go. And I see Nokia CO1 Plus, which possibly Ruth is observing that it's funny to use a non-Jewish cry, a non-Jew's cry. Yeah, that's why it's difficult explanation to exactly get your head around why the 100 blasts should be patterned on the cries of Sisera, which is why you have to get onto explanations like the one I gave. And as difficult as it might be, that Sisera's mother clearly is involved in some way in the blowing of shofar, because the Gemara uses her as a reference point to define what a teruah is. So she's definitely in there some way, knowing that, it kind of seems reasonable that we're trying to pattern 100 blasts after. Again, you can ask why the emphasis is there, and we try to offer something, but it does seem that she's placed in some way. But yes, I hear the challenge. Anyway, so thank you very much everyone for coming. We've tried to go through here and just explain how we started with 9 blasts on a Torah level, then out of doubt with different practices, we expand that out to 30. Then on a rabbinic level, we added on an extra 30 in order to confuse the Satan and in some way try and improve the outcome of our judgment on Rosh Hashanah. And then via custom, whether to pattern the blast of Sisera's mother, whether to pattern the cries of Sisera's mother, or to pattern after the cries of Sarah Imenu, that's how we get up to 100 blasts that we do today. Anyone has any other questions, please either message or come off mute. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining. Great, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.